Hidden laboratories held secrets that could shatter reality itself. Medieval alchemists were not just primitive chemists. They were pioneers operating at the dangerous intersection of science, spirituality, and magic. Their cryptic symbols and volatile experiments were part of a much grander quest. This journey will reveal the true purpose behind their work, a purpose that goes far beyond the myth of creating gold. You will understand how their centuries-old research still quietly shapes our modern world. What was the real formula they sought in their bubbling flasks, and why did they encode their knowledge in such mysterious art? What does it truly mean to transform one substance into another, and perhaps to transform oneself in the process? How far would you go to unlock the fundamental secrets of existence? The most legendary goal of all was the Philosopher's Stone. This was far more than a myth about making gold. For a medieval alchemist, the stone represented the ultimate achievement, a physical key to unlocking the universe's deepest secrets. It was described in cryptic manuscripts as a magnificent red powder, sometimes a translucent crystal possessing a divine inner fire. They believed this single substance could perform three miraculous acts. First, it could transmute a base metal like lead into pure, perfect gold. This was the test of its physical power. Second, it could be used to create the elixir of life, a potion granting immortality and eternal youth. But the third and most profound purpose was spiritual. The stone was said to offer ultimate enlightenment, a direct understanding of God and creation itself. This was the true prize that consumed them. The search for this one object drove brilliant minds to spend their entire lives and entire fortunes over blazing furnaces. They worked with toxic mercury and explosive salts, risking poison, fire, and financial ruin on a daily basis. Yet they persisted because the stone was not just a physical object. It was a symbol. It represented the pinnacle of human potential, the moment when something raw and imperfect could be refined into absolute perfection. This process of transformation was called the Great Work, and the ultimate proof that the great work was complete was the creation of the stone itself. The quest was never just about wealth. It was about achieving a state of flawless purity, both for matter and for the human soul. This pursuit of perfection inevitably turned inward toward the human body itself. If lead could be transformed into gold, then surely a mortal life could be refined into an immortal one. The legendary elixir of life was the ultimate application of this belief, a potion designed to cure all illness, restore youth, and grant eternity. Alchemists were not merely seeking a long life, they were attempting to conquer death itself through a chemical solution. In their view, aging was a form of corruption, a slow decay that the right substance could halt and reverse. The most famous story tells of Nicolas Flamel, a humble Parisian scribe who, according to widespread rumor, discovered the secret of the Philosopher's Stone and used it to create the elixir. He and his wife Perrinelle were said to have achieved immortality, with sightings of them reported for centuries after their supposed deaths. These tales fueled the dreams of countless alchemists who believed that such a feat was not just a fantasy but a tangible, chemical possibility. The connection between the stone and the elixir was fundamental. In alchemical tradition, the Philosopher's Stone was not just for transmuting metals, it was the ultimate medicine. A tiny fragment of the stone, dissolved in wine or another liquid, was believed to become the elixir of life. This one substance was thought to hold such a concentrated, perfect life force that it could purge all imperfection from the human body, healing it completely and indefinitely. To create these life-extending substances, alchemists experimented with a terrifying array of ingredients. They used rare herbs and roots gathered under specific astrological signs, but also highly toxic materials. Mercury, a shimmering liquid metal, was prized for its transformative properties despite the brain damage and organ failure it caused. Gold, the metal of perfection, was often powdered and ingested, based on the idea that its incorruptible nature could be transferred to the human body. The processes were just as dangerous as the ingredients, involving months of precise heating, cooling, and distillation in sealed vessels. One mistake could mean a poisonous explosion instead of a life-giving potion. These seekers of eternity were literally playing with fire, convinced that the secrets to everlasting life were hidden within the most volatile and deadly substances on Earth. This relentless experimentation demanded a unique and perilous workplace. Step inside a medieval alchemist's laboratory, and you would find a cramped, shadowy room thick with strange vapors and the ever-present scent of smoke. The heart of this space was the athana, the alchemical furnace. This was not a simple fireplace, but a complex tower-like structure designed to maintain a constant, gentle heat for months or even years on end. It was the womb for the great work, and its steady fire was a symbol of the alchemist's own unwavering patience. Surrounding this central furnace was an array of bizarre glassware that would look alien even to a modern chemist. Curved alembics and bulbous retorts connected by fragile glass tubes were used to capture and purify rising vapors. These vessels were the lungs of the operation, breathing in volatile spirits and breathing out purified essences. Every piece of equipment held a double meaning. The furnace represented the transformative fire of divine will. The distillation apparatus mirrored the process of separating the pure from the impure, both in matter and in the soul. This entire setup was a ticking time bomb. The constant work with flammable materials and pressurized glass made explosions a daily threat. Alchemists often wore thick leather aprons not for fashion, but as minimal protection against shattering equipment and scalding chemicals. Poisoning was an even more insidious danger. Many worked with mercury and lead, their hands constantly exposed to toxic powders and fuming liquids. A single misstep in a procedure could release a cloud of deadly gas, turning a quest for immortality into a sudden, painful death. Because of these dangers and to protect their secrets from prying eyes or greedy rulers, these laboratories were often hidden away. They were tucked into castle basements, secluded monastery chambers, or remote country cottages. This secrecy added another layer of mystery to their work, isolating them from a world that both feared and desired their knowledge. They operated in these self-imposed dungeons, dancing with poison and fire, all for a fleeting chance to grasp a power that always seemed just one experiment away. Their cryptic art was a language in itself, a code designed to protect profound secrets from the unprepared. To communicate with one another across continents and centuries, alchemists developed a rich tapestry of symbols where every image held a double meaning. The most famous of these is the ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. This was not a symbol of destruction, but of eternal cycles and the unity of all things. It represented the process of dissolution and coagulation, where matter must be broken down completely before it can be reborn in a perfected state. The endless cycle of eating and being born from itself mirrored the alchemist's work, a process that had to be repeated endlessly in the quest for purity. Another powerful image was the green lion, often shown devouring the sun. This fierce symbol did not depict a literal animal but a crucial chemical agent. The green lion represented a highly corrosive substance, often vitriol, which was used to dissolve raw gold, the sun metal. This was the dangerous first step in the great work, where the perfect metal had to be reduced to its base matter before it could be transformed. The lion's green color signified the raw, untamed power of nature, the primal force that the alchemist had to harness and master. Then there was the philosophical egg, a common vessel shown in intricate drawings. This was not merely a cooking pot, but the sealed glass container where the great transformation took place. It represented the universe in microcosm, a protected womb where the chaotic primal matter could be heated and nurtured until it gave birth to the philosopher's stone. Inside this egg, the opposing forces of the alchemical world, king and queen, sulfur and mercury, soul and spirit, were brought together to unite. This union was symbolized by one of the most mysterious figures, the Rebis. This was a two-headed, hermaphroditic being, often crowned and holding symbolic objects. The Rebis was the final product of the great work, the ultimate embodiment of perfection achieved through the marriage of opposites. It showed the balancing of male and female, solar and lunar, volatile and fixed principles into a single, complete and divine being. This was the ultimate goal, the creation of a perfected, unified self, reflected in the creation of the perfected stone. We can see these symbols come alive in famous texts like the Splendor Solis, a masterpiece of alchemical art. Its pages glow with vivid illuminations of flasks containing kings and queens, black suns, and soaring birds, each a precise visual metaphor for a stage in the chemical process. The blackening of matter, known as negrido, was shown as a death or a descent into a dark night. The whitening, or albedo, was depicted as a washing or a resurrection. Why go to such lengths to obscure their methods? The reasons were twofold. First was protection. An alchemist in the service of a king could be imprisoned until he produced endless gold, or executed if he failed. By writing in a code of pictures, they ensured that only a fellow adept, someone who had undergone years of study and spiritual preparation, could understand the true path. But the second reason was more profound. They believed that the mysteries of creation and the soul's journey toward God were too complex for ordinary words. How do you describe the moment of spiritual enlightenment, or the feeling of matter transforming at its most fundamental level? Sometimes only a symbol, a picture that speaks directly to the unconscious mind, can carry the full weight of a truth that words would only diminish. These complex symbols pointed toward a universal theory of matter. At the very core of all alchemical thought lay the three principles known as the tria-prima. Every substance in the world, from a lump of lead to a human body, was believed to be a mixture of philosophical sulfur, philosophical mercury, and philosophical salt. It is crucial to understand that these were not the common substances we know by those names today. They were instead profound metaphysical concepts, three essential spirits that gave matter its fundamental properties. Philosophical sulfur represented the soul of a thing. It was the principle of combustibility, of desire, and of that which connects matter to its unique identity. You could think of it as the fiery essence that makes gold yellow and lustrous, or that gives a person their driving passions. Philosophical mercury was the spirit. It was the principle of volatility, of fluidity, and of intelligence. This was the mercurial force that allowed metals to melt or a mind to shift its thoughts. Finally, philosophical salt was the body. It was the principle of fixity, of solidity, and of the material form that holds everything together. This was the earthy, stable foundation that gave substance its tangible presence in the world. The entire goal of the great work was to manipulate the balance of these three principles within a substance. An alchemist looked at a piece of base lead and saw a material where the three principles were in a state of impurity and imbalance. The salt or body was coarse and heavy, the sulfur or soul was dull and dim, the mercury or spirit was sluggish and trapped. The process of transmutation was not a simple chemical swap. It was a profound spiritual and physical purification. Through endless cycles of heating, dissolving, and coagulating, the alchemist sought to refine these principles. They would drive off the impure, coarse salt and replace it with a perfect crystalline salt. They would purify the dull sulfur until it shone with a solar brilliance. They would liberate the trapped mercury until it became a volatile, intelligent spirit. When these three purified principles were perfectly recombined, the result was no longer lead but gold. The metal itself was just the physical proof. The true transformation was happening on a cosmic scale, as the alchemist brought a piece of the material world into a state of divine harmony. And this process was always a mirror. As the alchemist worked to purify the sulfur, mercury, and salt in their flask, they were also striving to purify those same principles within their own being. They sought to burn away their base desires, the impure sulfur of their soul. They aimed to refine their fleeting thoughts into a clear and penetrating mercurial intelligence. And they worked to stabilize their physical body with the incorruptible salt of discipline and endurance. The laboratory work and the spiritual work were one and the same. To transform lead into gold was to transform a mortal, imperfect soul into an enlightened, perfected one. This is why the tria-prima was the invisible engine behind every symbol, every recipe, and every dangerous night spent tending the Athena's fire. These three principles operated within a grander cosmic framework, the world of the four classical elements. Earth, air, fire, and water were not just physical substances to a medieval alchemist, they were the fundamental states of all matter. Each element was defined by a pair of primary qualities. Fire was hot and dry, air was hot and wet, water was cold and wet, and earth was cold and dry. The entire material universe was seen as a vast dance of these four partners, constantly combining and separating. Transformation, therefore, was not about creating something from nothing. It was about rearranging these elemental qualities. To turn water into air, for instance, you simply needed to apply heat, changing its quality from cold to hot. This elegant, if flawed, system provided a complete map for manipulating reality. In the laboratory, these theories became tangible, dangerous actions. The element of fire was harnessed through the process of calcination. A substance would be roasted in an open crucible over a fierce flame until it was reduced to a dry, white ash. This was seen as burning away all moisture and volatile spirits, leaving behind only the pure, fixed body of the material, its essential salt. Water's primary laboratory action was distillation. A complex alembic would be used to gently boil a liquid, capturing its purified vapors in a cooling arm, where they would condense back into a liquid form. This was the art of separation, of drawing the subtle, mercurial spirit out of a coarse, earthly mixture. Each element had its role. Earth represented solidity and the final product, the crystal or powder left after all other operations were complete. Air was the medium of vapors, the invisible carrier that transported spirits from one vessel to another during sublimation. The ultimate goal of the great work was to achieve a perfect balance of all four elements within a single substance, creating a fifth essence, the fabled quintessence, which was immune to decay and change. This interconnected worldview did not stop at the laboratory door. It extended directly into the human body through the doctrine of the four humors. Physicians who followed alchemical principles believed that human health was a mirror of the elemental world. Blood was hot and wet, aligning with the element of air. Phlegm was cold and wet, corresponding to water. Yellow bile was hot and dry, just like fire. And black bile was cold and dry, embodying the earth. Sickness was viewed as an imbalance of these humors, an excess of one elemental quality over the others. An alchemist physician would not just treat symptoms, they would seek to rebalance the patient's internal elements. A fever, seen as an excess of fiery yellow bile, might be treated with cooling, watery remedies like cucumber or rosewater. An illness of lethargy and cold, an excess of earthy black bile, might be treated with warming, spicy herbs to stoke the internal fire. The same processes used to purify metals were applied to create medicines. Distillation was used to extract the quintessence, the pure life force, from plants and minerals, creating potent elixirs designed to rebalance the humors and restore health. This created a beautiful, if terrifying, symmetry. The universe, the laboratory, and the human body were all seen as different expressions of the same elemental dance. To understand how to transform lead was to understand how to heal a person. The bubbling flask and the beating heart were governed by the same immutable laws. So when an alchemist worked to adjust the heat under their Athena, they were not just following a recipe. They were participating in a cosmic act, carefully shifting the balance of hot and cold, wet and dry in a tiny fragment of the cosmos, hoping that their skill could coax matter, and perhaps even life itself, toward a more perfect state. This cosmic dance of elements found its perfect expression in the 7 known metals, each one governed by a celestial body. Medieval alchemists saw a direct, living link between the metals they worked with in their laboratories and the planets moving in the heavens above. Gold was the metal of the sun, embodying its radiant, perfect, and incorruptible nature. Silver belonged to the cool, reflective moon. The swift, liquid metal Mercury was tied to the planet Mercury. Copper, with its warm, reddish glow, was the metal of Venus. Iron, hard and suited for war, was ruled by Mars. Jupiter, the king of the gods, governed the expansive metal tin. And finally, there was lead, the heaviest and dullest metal, which fell under the gloomy influence of Saturn. These were not just poetic labels. In the medieval worldview, this was a literal, metaphysical reality. The planets were not distant rocks of gas, they were divine intelligences, and their spiritual energies physically composed the metals found deep within the earth. A vein of silver was quite literally a piece of the moon's essence solidified within the planetary body. A nugget of gold was a fragment of the sun's power, congealed and waiting to be awakened. This belief made the alchemists' work a form of celestial gardening. They were not creating gold from nothing. They were nurturing the seed of solar perfection they believed was already hidden within a base metal like lead, accelerating a natural process that would otherwise take millennia deep underground. This profound connection dictated the very rhythm of their work. An alchemist would never begin a crucial operation without first consulting the stars. The complex astrological charts they drew were as essential as their furnaces and alembics. They operated on the principle of planetary hours, certain times of day and night that were believed to be infused with the specific power of a given planet. If an alchemist wanted to work with silver, they would schedule their distillation for a Monday, the day of the moon, and ideally during a lunar hour. To manipulate iron, they would choose a Tuesday, the day of Mars. This was not superstition, it was applied science. They genuinely believed that the celestial tides of influence could make a reaction succeed or fail, that the moon's pull could help draw forth a mercurial spirit, or that the sun's radiant power could fix a transformation permanently. Consider the monumental task of trying to create the Philosopher's Stone. The final stage, the exaltation of the matter into the red stone, was almost always timed to coincide with a powerful astrological configuration, like the sun entering the sign of Leo, its own royal domain. They were attempting to harness the entire cosmos in a single glass vessel. This is why their manuscripts are filled with intricate diagrams showing planets positioned above their apparatus. The laboratory was a microcosm, a miniature universe where the forces of the macrocosm, the great cosmos, could be channeled and directed. When an alchemist placed a piece of lead, the metal of Saturn, into their flask, they saw a cold, slow, ancient planetary intelligence. Their goal was to subject it to a celestial symphony, using the combined influences of the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter to drive off Saturn's gloomy nature and replace it with solar brilliance. The entire laboratory process was a battle of planetary influences, a guided transformation of one celestial state into another. Their success or failure was written not just in their recipe books but in the stars themselves. At the heart of every smoky laboratory was the great work, a meticulous sequence of operations believed to guide matter from its base state to spiritual and physical perfection. This was the path of transmutation, a journey often mapped in 12 symbolic gates, each one a dangerous and demanding chemical process. It began with calcination, where the raw material, usually lead, was roasted to a black ash. This stage, called the nigrido or blackening, represented death. The original form had to be utterly destroyed, its identity burned away in the furnace of divine judgment. The alchemist watched for this blackness as the first true sign that the work had begun, a necessary descent into primordial chaos. From that black ash, the process of separation began. The material was dissolved in powerful acids, often symbolized by a putrefaction where it would seem to rot and decay. This was about breaking everything down to its most fundamental parts. Then, through repeated distillation and washing, a phase known as the albedo or whitening would emerge. The blackened matter would slowly turn a brilliant lunar white. This was the first purification, a resurrection from the black night, where the mercurial spirit was cleansed and the material took on a silvery, purified quality. After the white stage came the citrinitas or yellowing. The white substance was subjected to a new, carefully controlled heat, causing it to take on a golden or yellow hue. This was the dawning of the solar principle, the first glimmer of the sun's power within the matter, but the final and most critical gate was the rubedo, the reddening. Through an intense, sustained fire, the yellow matter would deepen into a magnificent royal red. This was the color of the philosopher's stone itself, the ultimate proof that the great work was complete. The base metal had been utterly transmuted, its internal principles perfectly balanced and solarized. Yet in every flask and every furnace, the alchemist saw a mirror of their own soul. As they guided matter through the black night of Negrido, they too endured a spiritual death, confronting their own flaws and ego. The whitening albedo was their own conscience being cleansed and clarified. The golden citrinitas represented the illumination of their mind, and the final crimson rubedo was the achievement of a divine, unified self, a soul perfectly aligned with creation. This is why documented, verifiable transmutations are so rare. For the true adept, creating a lump of gold was almost a secondary concern, a mere byproduct of a much greater spiritual victory. A successful transmutation was not just a chemical reaction, it was a moment of cosmic grace where the inner and outer work perfectly aligned. To an outside observer, it would have been impossible to separate the mystical act of will from the physical combination of ingredients. The few who claimed success may have been frauds, or they may have been describing a profound, personal transformation that simply manifested in their laboratory as a token of their achievement. The true gold they sought was not meant for the royal treasury, but for the human spirit. This profound inner journey was meticulously recorded in extraordinary books, texts designed to be read by only a handful of people in the entire world. Alchemical manuscripts were not simple instructions, they were labyrinths of coded knowledge where a single wrong turn could lead to madness or disaster. Perhaps the most influential of all was a text barely a page long, the Emerald Tablet, attributed to the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus. Its opening lines contained the entire philosophy of alchemy in one cryptic statement, as above, so below. This single phrase established the core belief that the patterns of the cosmos are perfectly mirrored in the smallest particle of matter. The secrets of the stars could be found in a grain of sand, and the path to God was hidden within the chemistry of a metal. The tablet's dense, poetic language spoke of the one thing that fathered all of creation, a primal substance that the alchemist sought to isolate and master. For centuries, every major alchemist in Europe would write a commentary on this short text, each trying to unravel its layers of meaning. Another breathtaking example is the Ripley Scroll, a long, illustrated manuscript that unfolds like a majestic tapestry. It does not list ingredients or temperatures. Instead, it tells the story of the great work through a series of vivid, symbolic images. A dragon devouring its own tail leads to a king and queen lying dead in a tomb, only to be resurrected by a heavenly dew. A green lion holds the key, and a pelican feeding its young with its own blood signifies a crucial stage of distillation. To read the Ripley Scroll was to walk a symbolic path, where each image represented a specific chemical process and a simultaneous stage of spiritual development. Only an initiate, someone who had already been taught the basic operations, could hope to decipher its visual poetry and follow the map it provided. Why wrap life-saving knowledge in such impenetrable riddles? The primary reason was survival. An alchemist who openly claimed to know how to make gold would instantly become a target. Kings and emperors would imprison them, demanding endless wealth and threatening torture or execution when the complex, slow processes inevitably failed to meet royal deadlines. By writing in a code of allegory and complex illustration, they protected themselves. A casual reader or a greedy prince would see only mystical nonsense, while a fellow adept trained in the same symbolic language would see a clear, precise recipe. This practice of concealment extended to the very names of the authors. Many alchemists wrote under glorious pseudonyms or attributed their works to ancient authorities like Aristotle or King Solomon. This was not simple plagiarism. It was a way to lend credibility and a cloak of ancient wisdom to their new and often heretical ideas. The brilliant 8th century Arab alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Europe as Geber, wrote hundreds of texts that mixed practical, groundbreaking chemistry with profound mystical speculation. His detailed descriptions of how to purify metals and prepare acids provided a solid foundation for all later European alchemy, yet they were always framed within a spiritual quest. Similarly, the German bishop Albertus Magnus produced encyclopedic works that blended Aristotle's natural philosophy with alchemical theory, giving the entire practice a sheen of intellectual respectability. Creating one of these illuminated manuscripts was an alchemical act in itself. A single book could take years to complete. Scribes would work by candlelight, carefully copying the cryptic text onto costly vellum made from animal skin. Then, illustrators would painstakingly paint the magnificent illustrations using pigments ground from precious minerals and plants. Gold leaf was applied to illuminate the pages, making the books physically valuable objects that mirrored the spiritual value of their contents. These were not mass-produced manuals. They were unique artifacts often passed down from master to student as the most precious item in their possession. They were preserved and studied in secret by networks of adepts, sometimes forming the core knowledge of elusive secret societies who saw themselves as the guardians of a divine science. To hold such a manuscript was to hold a key, but a key that would only turn the lock for someone who had already undergone the long and arduous preparation to understand it. The true secret these books protected was not merely a chemical formula, but a state of mind, a way of seeing the world where every symbol was a doorway and every process a prayer. But this secret knowledge existed in a world dominated by a single, towering institution. The relationship between alchemists and the Catholic Church was a dangerous and deeply complicated dance. On one hand, the Church held the power to declare any practice heretical, a sentence that could lead to imprisonment or a fiery death. Many conservative theologians saw alchemy as a direct challenge to divine authority. They argued that only God could perform true miracles of transformation, and that any human attempt to create gold or the elixir of life was not just arrogant but a pact with demonic forces. This fear was made official in 1314, when Pope John XXII issued a formal decree titled Spondet quas non exhibent, which translates to "they promise what they do not deliver." This papal bull specifically targeted fraudulent alchemists who produced counterfeit gold, condemning their deceptions. Yet, in a stunning contradiction, historians strongly suspect this very same pope was a secret practitioner of the art, maintaining his own private laboratory. This duality captures the Church's entire stance, a mixture of public condemnation and private fascination. Church councils also weighed in on this mysterious science. The Council of Trent, which began in 1545, reinforced the Church's position against any form of occult practice, a category into which alchemy was often placed. For an alchemist, this created an incredibly perilous landscape. To be accused of heresy was a constant threat, forcing many to cloak their work in layers of Christian symbolism. They described the philosopher's stone using terms like the Holy Spirit or Christ, and framed the entire great work as an allegory for the soul's journey toward God. This was not just clever disguise, it was a genuine expression of their belief, but it was also a necessary strategy for survival. Some found refuge within the church itself. Monasteries became unexpected sanctuaries for alchemical research. Within the secluded scriptoriums and hidden workshops of these religious houses, monk alchemists could pursue their studies with a degree of protection. They had the time, the resources, and the relative privacy to conduct their long, slow experiments, all while framing their work as an exploration of God's creation. The monastery laboratory was a perfect microcosm of the alchemical world itself, a place where spiritual devotion and material investigation were inextricably linked. This strange intersection produced some of history's most fascinating figures. Thomas Aquinas, the immense theological philosopher, deeply engaged with alchemical ideas. Before his death in 1274, he wrote several texts examining the theory of metallic transmutation, carefully arguing for its possibility within a Christian framework. He sought to reconcile this ancient art with the new learning of his time, seeing it as a valid part of natural philosophy. Then there is the enigmatic case of Pope John XXII. Despite his own decree against fraudulent alchemists, an inventory of his personal possessions after his death revealed a stunning collection of alchemical apparatus and a substantial quantity of gold bullion that far exceeded the papal treasury's normal holdings. The whispers were that he had not been condemning the art itself, but only its charlatans, while secretly mastering its true form. For every alchemist working under the protective roof of a monastery, there were a dozen others operating in the shadows of secular cities. They relied on coded language and trusted networks of initiates to share their findings, always aware that a single misspoken word or a jealous rival could bring the wrath of both the church and the state down upon them. Theirs was a life balanced on a knife's edge, pursuing a divine science in a world that could, in an instant, brand it as the devil's work. Behind the veils of convents and within the shadows of famous workshops, women pursued the great work with a determination that history often tried to erase. While the standard narrative of alchemy is dominated by bearded sages, a number of brilliant female practitioners made foundational contributions, their identities often hidden behind pseudonyms or absorbed into the legends of their male counterparts. One of the earliest and most important was Maria the Jewess, a figure from the first few centuries whose practical inventions became the bedrock of the alchemical laboratory for over 1,000 years. She is credited with devising the water bath, a gentle heating apparatus that bears her name to this day, the bain-marie. This simple yet revolutionary device allowed for the steady, controlled heating of delicate substances that would be ruined by a direct flame. She also pioneered the tribicos, a three-armed still used for distillation, and the kerotakis, a sealed vessel for exposing materials to vapors. These were not mere tools, they were the very engines of alchemical process, and they came from the mind of a woman whose own life remains shrouded in mystery. Around the same time, another shadowy figure emerged, Cleopatra the alchemist. She was not the Egyptian queen, but a learned scholar who authored texts like Chrysopoeia, meaning the making of gold. Her writings blended practical chemical advice with profound philosophical insights, and she is often depicted alongside the ouroboros, the serpent of eternity, a symbol she helped popularize in the Western alchemical tradition. Then there is Nicolas Flamel, the wife of the legendary Nicolas Flamel. While Nicolas's name echoes through history, contemporary accounts and legal documents suggest Nicolas was far more than a silent partner. She was a skilled and knowledgeable alchemist in her own right, deeply involved in their shared work, and many even speculated that she was the true mastermind behind their alleged successes. For a woman to practice alchemy openly was to invite suspicion and danger. They were barred from universities and guilds, and their intellectual pursuits were often viewed with hostility or dismissed as witchcraft. To circumvent these barriers, many women conducted their research within the relative safety of convent walls. A convent provided not only seclusion and a library, but also a community of like-minded women who could share knowledge discreetly. Others worked as assistants or partners to their fathers, husbands, or brothers, their own labor and genius anonymized within a man's published work. This erasure was systematic. A text written by a woman might be published under a male pseudonym or, more commonly, attributed directly to a famous male alchemist after her death. Countless anonymous manuscripts that formed the backbone of alchemical knowledge were likely penned by women whose names we will never know, yet their influence is etched into the very symbolism of the art. The alchemical process itself was deeply feminine. The philosophical egg was a womb where transformation gestated. The entire work was often described as a sacred marriage, the hieros gamos between a king and queen, sulfur and mercury, representing the union of opposites necessary for creation. This was not a metaphor imposed by men, but one that likely grew from the contributions and perspectives of women who saw the creative power of their own bodies reflected in the creative work of the laboratory. Their legacy is a testament to a quiet, relentless pursuit of knowledge, a hidden current of intellectual power that flowed just beneath the surface, fundamentally shaping a tradition that pretended it wasn't there. The same flasks that sought to transmute metal also brewed potent remedies for a suffering world. Alchemical medicine transformed the healer's art from a practice of simple herbal poultices into a sophisticated chemical science. These pioneers believed that if they could perfect metals, they could surely perfect the human body. They began systematically distilling the essences of plants, capturing what they called the quintessence, the pure life force hidden within a herb or flower. This was not merely making a strong tea, it was a sacred process of separation, using their complex glassware to isolate what they saw as the plant's soul, its most active and potent medicinal spirit. One of their most famous and lasting creations was laudanum, a powerful tincture of opium. The alchemist Paracelsus, a figure of immense controversy and genius, is credited with its development. He dissolved opium in alcohol, creating a reliable, potent painkiller that would remain a cornerstone of medicine for centuries. This was a perfect example of the alchemical approach, using a chemical process, dissolution in alcohol, to unlock and stabilize the healing power of a natural substance. Paracelsus stood as a revolutionary who permanently changed the course of medicine. He openly challenged the ancient teachings of Galen, which focused on balancing the body's four humors with herbal remedies. Paracelsus declared that the true causes of disease were not internal imbalances alone, but specific external entities that attacked the body. He argued that just as alchemists used specific chemicals to transform metals, physicians should use specific chemical medicines to target these disease entities. His famous motto was, "The dose makes the poison." This single idea captured the entire alchemical tightrope. He boldly introduced minerals and metals into the pharmacy. He prescribed mercury to treat syphilis and antimony to induce vomiting and purification. To his contemporaries, this was madness, like using fire to put out a fire. Yet Paracelsus saw these toxic substances as powerful tools. In the right, minuscule dose, a poison could become a cure, shocking the body and driving out the disease. This was a terrifyingly dangerous practice. The line between a healing elixir and a deadly poison was vanishingly thin. Alchemists became the first true toxicologists, meticulously studying the effects of substances like arsenic and mercury on the human body. They learned to manipulate these powerful agents, walking a razor's edge where a miscalculation by a single grain could turn a life-saving remedy into an agent of agonizing death. Their laboratories were thus places of dual purpose, where the same apparatus used to seek the philosopher's stone was also used to distill life-saving essences and compound metallic medicines. They developed purified alcohols, concentrated acids, and stable mineral compounds, creating the very foundation of the modern pharmacist shelf. The quest for a universal panacea, a single cure-all medicine, mirrored the quest for the philosopher's stone itself. In their drive to conquer all illness, they laid the practical and philosophical groundwork for pharmacology, transforming medicine from an art of gentle herbs into a powerful, precise, and perilous science of chemicals. But the ultimate expression of this power was not merely healing the body, it was creating life from scratch. Alchemists dared to dream of the homunculus, a miniature, fully formed human being grown not in a womb but in a glass vessel. This was the pinnacle of their art, the moment a human would become a creator, mirroring the divine act itself. Surviving recipes for these artificial beings read like pages from a forbidden grimoire. One infamous method attributed to the legendary Paracelsus began with human sperm sealed inside a sealed glass flask. This vessel was then buried in fresh horse manure for 40 days. The manure provided a constant, gentle, fermenting heat, acting as a natural incubator. During this time, the alchemist had to magnetize the flask daily, channeling their own life force and the cosmic energy of the stars into the developing form. After 40 days, the recipe claimed the substance would become moving and living, looking like a human but transparent. It then had to be fed daily with a small amount of human blood for another 40 weeks, growing into a perfect, albeit tiny, human child, a homunculus. The philosophical implications of this were staggering. In a medieval Christian world where the creation of life was the sole province of God, this was the most profound heresy imaginable. It was an attempt to steal the sacred fire of Genesis, to bypass the natural order and claim the power of life and death for human hands. The homunculus was not just a scientific experiment, it was a theological rebellion. It asked the most dangerous question of all: if humans are made in God's image, do we not also contain the spark of creation within us? For the alchemist, the answer was a resounding yes. The successful creation of a homunculus would be the final proof that they had unlocked the secret laws of the universe, that they understood the recipe for life itself. This quest was deeply intertwined with their other goals. The same philosopher's stone that could transmute metal and heal the body was also believed to be the vital agent that could animate the homunculus. It was the universal life force, the concentrated spark that could jump from the mineral kingdom to create a living being. These ideas did not vanish with the Middle Ages. The legend of the homunculus seeped into literature, most famously in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, where the learned doctor and his assistant Wagner create a tiny, glowing homunculus in a vial, a being of pure consciousness trapped in glass. This fictional creature grapples with its own artificial nature, longing for a real body and a genuine soul. The homunculus also shares a deep kinship with the Jewish golem, a being of clay animated by sacred words and ritual. Both are artificial humans created through a precise, formulaic process. But where the golem is a massive, mute servant made from earth and spirit, the homunculus is a tiny, intellectual being born from chemistry and will. One emerges from the soil of tradition, the other from the laboratory of ambition. The alchemist's dream of artificial life was a precursor to our own modern debates on genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. They were the first to ask the questions we still struggle with today. What is the true source of life? What responsibilities come with the power to create it? And what does it mean for a creator when their creation looks back at them? The movements of the planets were the true clock of the alchemical laboratory. An alchemist would never simply begin a major operation on a random Tuesday, for the success of their entire endeavor depended on aligning their earthly work with the celestial rhythms above. This was not a side interest, it was the very framework of their science. They operated in a universe where every metal, every process, and every moment in time was governed by a specific celestial intelligence. The 7 known planets each ruled a metal. The sun governed gold, the moon silver, Mercury quicksilver, Venus copper, Mars iron, Jupiter tin, and Saturn lead. But these were more than just names, they were a literal reality. A vein of iron was seen as a physical manifestation of the planet Mars's fiery energy solidified within the Earth. To transform lead, the heavy, cold metal of Saturn, into solar gold required nothing less than a celestial rebellion inside the flask. The alchemist had to harness the combined powers of the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter to overwhelm and transmute the gloomy influence of Saturn. This belief dictated a rigorous schedule. An operation involving silver, the metal of the moon, would be meticulously planned for a Monday, the moon's day, and ideally during one of the planetary hours also ruled by the moon. These planetary hours divided the day and night into unequal segments, each one pulsating with the unique energy of a different celestial body. To distill a mercurial spirit, they might wait for an hour ruled by Mercury itself, believing that the planet's intellectual, fluid nature would help draw the volatile essence from the material. This precise timing was considered as crucial as the purity of the ingredients. Before even lighting the furnace, an alchemist would cast a complex astrological chart. This map of the heavens was their ultimate guide. They looked for powerful, auspicious alignments. The final, critical stage of creating the philosopher's stone, the rubedo or reddening, was often timed to coincide with the sun entering the regal, fiery sign of Leo. They sought to capture the peak of solar power, channeling it directly into their vessel to fix the transformation permanently. Even the zodiac played its part. The 12 signs were seen as governing different parts of the human body and different stages of chemical transformation. The entire laboratory was a microcosm, a miniature universe designed to attract and focus the forces of the macrocosm. When they sealed their philosophical egg, they were not just creating a chemical reactor, they were constructing a tiny cosmos, a womb where the energies of the stars could directly interact with matter. This profound integration of astrology and alchemy was the logical outcome of a worldview that saw no separation between the heavens and the earth. The same laws that guided the planets in their orbits were believed to govern the growth of a plant and the transformation of a metal. To work in the laboratory was to participate in a cosmic dance, a sacred act of synchronizing human will with the divine mechanics of the universe itself. Their laboratories were filled with a slow, invisible poison. The shimmering liquid metal mercury was a particular obsession for medieval alchemists who prized it for its strange, transformative properties. It could dissolve gold, it flowed like water yet weighed like stone, and it seemed to capture the very essence of fluid intelligence they called philosophical mercury. Yet this beautiful, silvery substance released a toxic vapor with every heating, every distillation. Prolonged exposure attacks the nervous system, causing the mercurial tremors known as the hatter's shakes, a constant trembling of the hands that would have made their delicate work even more perilous. It eroded their minds, leading to memory loss, irritability, and paranoia, symptoms that to an outsider might have looked like madness or even demonic possession. Mercury was not alone in its deadly nature. They regularly worked with arsenic, a white powder used to whiten metals in the albedo stage of the work. Inhaling its fine dust during grinding or heating would cause violent stomach cramps, nerve damage, and a slow, painful decline. Then there was lead, the very symbol of the base metal they sought to transform. They handled it constantly, melting it in crucibles and working with its toxic salts. Lead poisoning accumulates silently in the body, causing fatigue, severe abdominal pain they called painter's colic, and a gradual erosion of cognitive function. For an alchemist, the first sign of enlightenment might have been the slow dimming of their own intellect. Many of these seekers of eternal life were almost certainly guaranteeing themselves an early and agonizing death. Their physical suffering is written in the historical symptoms they described, the tremors and mental decays that match perfectly with chronic heavy metal poisoning. Yet, in a tragic irony, this daily dance with death gave them an unparalleled practical education in chemistry. They became the first true experimental toxicologists. Through gruesome trial and fatal error, they learned which substances were most corrosive, which fumes could kill, and how to handle materials that demanded the utmost respect. Some alchemists did recognize the dangers and developed rudimentary safety protocols. They advised working in well-ventilated spaces, using bellows to direct fumes away from the face. Some manuscripts depict practitioners wearing simple face coverings or working near open windows. They understood that certain operations should not be performed in a confined space, and they learned to recognize the distinctive, sickly sweet smell of arsenic or the metallic taste of mercury vapor in the air. These were the first steps toward laboratory safety, born not from theory but from the stark reality of watching colleagues sicken and die. For every cautious adept who lived to old age, there were countless others who became martyrs to their art, their quest for perfection ultimately consumed by the very poisons they believed would unlock the secrets of the universe. This shimmering, toxic dream of transmutation had a dark and cynical shadow. For every dedicated seeker working in good faith, there were countless charlatans preying on the hopes of the greedy and the desperate. These fraudulent alchemists perfected a repertoire of clever tricks designed to create the illusion of a successful transformation right before a patron's eyes. One of the most common deceptions involved a hollow stirring rod, secretly filled with gold dust and plugged with wax. An alchemist would dramatically stir a pot of molten lead over a fire, and the heat would melt the wax plug, releasing the hidden gold into the mixture. To the astonished observer, it appeared as if the base metal had been miraculously turned into pure gold right in the crucible. Another popular method used chemically treated metals. A coin could be made from an alloy of gold and silver, then treated with a corrosive substance that would eat away the silver from the surface, leaving behind a thin, deceptive shell of pure gold. The coin would look and feel like gold, passing initial tests only to later reveal its worthless core. Why would someone risk their life practicing such an elaborate and dangerous fraud? The motivations were as base as the metals they pretended to transform. The most powerful driver was the relentless pressure of royal patronage. A king or emperor who funded an alchemist's laboratory expected a return on his investment, and failure was not an option. An alchemist who could not produce gold on demand faced dire consequences, from imprisonment and torture to execution. A clever deception could buy precious time, or even secure a generous reward and a temporary escape. Others turned to fraud simply for profit, swindling wealthy merchants and nobles who were eager to believe in a get-rich-quick scheme. They would perform a convincing fake transmutation to secure a large investment, then disappear with the funds before their trickery was discovered. The damage these frauds inflicted was immense. They tarnished the entire field, making it increasingly difficult for genuine experimenters to be taken seriously. One notorious case involved a man named Edward Kelly, who partnered with the respected scholar John Dee. Kelly claimed to communicate with angels and to possess the secret of transmutation, using his charismatic showmanship to secure the patronage of Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. Despite years of promises and spectacular demonstrations, no lasting gold was ever produced, and the scandal severely damaged the credibility of all alchemists at the imperial court. This widespread deception inevitably provoked a backlash. As early as the 14th century, Pope John XXII issued his bull against alchemists who promised what they could not deliver. By the 16th and 17th centuries, many European states began passing strict laws against the practice of transmutation, imposing heavy fines and even the death penalty for those convicted of alchemical fraud. The prevalence of trickery forced a climate of deep skepticism, pushing the real chemical discoveries of the adepts further into the shadows, where the line between profound truth and elaborate lie became almost impossible to see. Yet the most profound transmutation occurred not in the flask, but within the alchemist's own being. For many practitioners, the entire laboratory process was a grand allegory, a physical mirror of a far more important spiritual journey. The true philosopher's stone was not a physical object to be created, but a state of grace to be achieved within the soul. This spiritual gold, often called the inner stone, represented divine wisdom, self-mastery, and the ultimate realization of one's own divine nature. The long and perilous work in the laboratory was in essence a form of active meditation. As the alchemist patiently guided base matter through its stages of blackening, whitening, and reddening, they were simultaneously guiding their own spirit through a parallel transformation. The initial stage, the nigredo, was more than just the blackening of lead. It symbolized the dark night of the soul, a necessary descent where the alchemist had to confront their own ego, their flaws, and their spiritual imperfections. This was a painful, inward death where the old self had to be burned away in the furnace of self-examination. From that inner darkness emerged the albedo, the whitening. This was the cleansing of the conscience, a lunar clarity where the mind was washed clean of its attachments and distractions. The soul, now purified, began to reflect a higher truth, much like the moon reflects the light of the sun. The final stage, the rubedo or reddening, was the culmination. It represented the birth of the inner stone, the moment the soul was fully illuminated and united with the divine will, burning with a sacred crimson fire of enlightenment. This is why the cryptic texts are filled with instructions that seem impossible to follow in a physical laboratory. They speak of needing a pure heart and a mind focused on God. They insist that the work will fail if the operator is driven by greed or pride. The fire of the athana had to be matched by the fire of spiritual devotion. The sealed philosophical egg was not just a glass vessel. It was the alchemist's own heart, a protected space where the chaotic elements of their personality could be sealed away and nurtured until the golden child of a higher consciousness was born. This profound spiritual dimension naturally attracted religious mystics and philosophers who had little interest in material gold. They saw in alchemy a precise map of the soul's journey back to its source. A Christian mystic, for instance, might interpret the death and resurrection of the king and queen in the flask as the crucifixion and rebirth of Christ within the human soul. The sacred marriage of sulfur and mercury became the union of the human soul with the Holy Spirit. For these seekers, the laboratory was a chapel, and every distillation was a prayer. The ultimate goal was to achieve the rebis state within oneself, a perfect balance of all opposing forces where the inner male and female, the active and the receptive, the spirit and the body, were harmonized into a single enlightened being. The creation of a lump of gold in a crucible was at best a pleasant side effect, a mere echo of the real and lasting treasure forged within. Their cryptic symbols and spiritual theories found physical form in tangible, often grueling recipes. To understand the alchemist's world, you must step away from the grand philosophy and into the soot-stained reality of their daily work. One of the most fundamental operations was calcination. This was not a gentle heating, but a fierce, prolonged roasting of a metal, usually lead, in an open crucible. The alchemist would watch as the dull gray lump, subjected to the relentless fire of the athana, slowly transformed into a powdery black ash. This was the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary death of the original form. The goal was to burn away all moisture and volatile spirits, leaving behind only the fixed body of the metal, a substance they considered its essential salt. Following calcination came dissolution. The blackened ash would be carefully transferred to a glass matras, a round-bottomed flask, and a powerful acid would be poured over it. The most common was vinegar, but for more potent dissolutions, they used what they called oil of vitriol, a substance we know as sulfuric acid. Creating oil of vitriol was a dangerous process in itself, involving the heating of green vitriol or iron sulfate. in a sealed retort until it released choking, corrosive fumes that condensed into the precious liquid. When this oil was added to the calcined metal, a dramatic reaction would often occur, the solid ash seeming to rot and dissolve into a murky, chaotic solution. This stage of putrefaction was seen as the material returning to its primal, chaotic state. The next step was to bring order from this chaos through separation. The murky solution would be subjected to filtration and repeated washing, sometimes for weeks, to separate the pure from the impure. The most prized method for this was distillation. The liquid would be poured into a curving alembic, a device that looked like a glass teapot with a long, tapering spout. As the flask was heated, the purest, most volatile parts of the solution would vaporize, travel down the cooled spout, and drip as a purified liquid into a receiving flask. This was how they captured the mercurial spirit of a substance, what they called its quintessence. The remaining solid matter, the dross, was discarded. Once the pure principles were isolated, the alchemist moved to conjunction, the sacred marriage. The purified mercurial spirit would be recombined with the fixed salt in a new vessel, the philosophical egg. This sealed glass container was then placed back into the athana, where a gentle, continuous heat was applied. This stage, known as fermentation, could last for months. The alchemist watched for signs of life within the egg, a slow internal movement or a change in color, indicating that the two opposing principles were uniting and generating a new, living substance. The final stages were coagulation and sebation. As the heat was carefully increased, the liquid within the egg would thicken and solidify into a stone-like mass. Throughout this process, the alchemist might open the vessel to add tiny, precise amounts of the original material, feeding the growing stone in a process called sebation, like feeding a newborn child. The ultimate goal was to see the matter pass through the colors of the great work, from black to white to yellow, and finally to the magnificent red of the philosopher's stone. The challenges they faced were immense. Their raw materials were never pure. A batch of lead could be contaminated with copper or arsenic, ruining months of work with an unknown variable. Their heat sources were wildly inconsistent. A gust of wind or a dying coal could drop the temperature of the athana just enough to halt a critical reaction. And time was their most demanding master. A single recipe for philosophical mercury, a specially prepared form of quicksilver, might involve 40 repetitions of distillation and coagulation, a process spanning an entire year or more. They worked in a world without standard measurements or reliable thermometers, guided only by the subtle colors in their flasks and a patient, unwavering belief that they were partners in a cosmic act of creation. Roger Bacon's Oxford laboratory was a place of both profound insight and deliberate secrecy. This 13th century Franciscan friar, often called Dr. Mirabilis, championed a radical idea for his time, that knowledge must be confirmed through direct observation and experiment. He meticulously documented his work with optics, gunpowder, and alchemy, yet he knew the dangers of sharing such power too freely. Much of his alchemical writing was intentionally encrypted, veiled in complex ciphers to prevent the unworthy from accessing knowledge he feared could be misused. He believed alchemy was the pinnacle of practical science, capable of producing marvels that would benefit all of humanity, but only if guided by a moral and prepared mind. While legends later swirled around his name, suggesting he had created a brazen head that could speak prophecies, the real Roger Bacon was a pioneer who laid the philosophical groundwork for the entire scientific method, all while encoding his most potent secrets to protect the world from itself. Then we have the most famous alchemist of all, a man whose legend utterly eclipses the historical person, Nicolas Flamel. The real Flamel was a prosperous Parisian scribe and bookseller who lived in the 14th century. He was undoubtedly a learned man, but court documents and his own will paint a picture of a successful businessman, not a mystical adept. The legend, however, began percolating over a century after his death. Tales emerged that he had discovered an ancient alchemical book, the Book of Abramelin the Mage, and with his wife Perenelle, had successfully decoded its secrets to create the Philosopher's Stone. The story claimed they used it to transmute lead into gold, amassing a vast fortune which they secretly used to fund charities and build houses for the poor. Most fantastically, they were said to have achieved immortality, with reported sightings of the couple for centuries after their recorded deaths. This powerful narrative transformed a respectable scribe into an icon of hidden wisdom and eternal life, a myth that persists precisely because it fulfills the ultimate alchemical dream, not just of wealth but of secret virtue and earthly transcendence. Across Europe, Arnold of Villanova served as a bridge between the laboratory and the highest echelons of power. This 13th-century physician, theologian, and alchemist was a trusted medical advisor to popes and kings, including the powerful Pope Boniface VIII. His practical work in distilling alcohols and extracting essential oils from plants led to genuine medical advances. He authored influential texts on wine and medicinal remedies, blending the humoral theory of Galen with a more experimental alchemical approach. Arnold firmly believed in the possibility of transmutation and the medical power of the Philosopher's Stone, which he called the quintessence. His high-profile life demonstrates how alchemical knowledge was not always a persecuted secret, but could be a respected, if controversial, pursuit at the very heart of medieval society. His legacy is a mix of documented medical contributions and alchemical speculations that later generations would expand into more elaborate legends. The influence of the Arab world on European alchemy was immense, and no figure looms larger than Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber. Though he lived in the 8th century, his vast body of work, comprising hundreds of texts, was translated into Latin and became the bedrock of medieval alchemical practice. Geber's contributions were profoundly practical. He provided the first clear, detailed descriptions of fundamental chemical processes that are still used today, including distillation, crystallization, and filtration. He discovered and described powerful acids like nitric acid and aqua regia, the only substance capable of dissolving gold. His experimental rigor was unparalleled for his time, insisting on meticulous record-keeping and the purification of reagents. Yet his work was always framed within a grand spiritual philosophy. He developed the seminal theory of the balance of natures in metals, a precursor to the later tria-prima, and his writings are filled with mystical numerology. The name Geber itself became a brand, a seal of authority, so much so that later European writers penned their own works under his name to lend them credibility. The real Jabir and the pseudonymous Geber together created a system that was both a practical laboratory manual and a guide to cosmic mysteries. Separating these historical figures from their legendary afterlives reveals a crucial pattern. The myths of immortality and infinite wealth were not random inventions. They were the ultimate expression of the culture's deepest desires, projected onto the lives of genuinely brilliant and innovative individuals. The real work of a Roger Bacon or a Geber was often slow, painstaking, and focused on tangible, if incremental, progress. The legends, however, promised a sudden and total victory over the limitations of matter, time, and mortality. We remember Flamel not for his scribble work, but for the story that he cracked the code, that he and his partner achieved the ultimate success. These enduring tales are not mere falsehoods, they are the cultural echo of the great work itself, a dream of perfection so powerful it could reshape history long after the laboratory fires had grown cold. The same furnaces that once held the promise of spiritual gold began to produce something far more valuable, reproducible facts. This slow transformation from alchemy to chemistry was not a sudden revolution but a gradual shift in focus, where the mystical quest for the Philosopher's Stone was slowly overshadowed by a new demand for verifiable results. Later practitioners started to emphasize what their predecessors had often overlooked: meticulous measurement, transparent methods, and experiments that could be repeated by anyone, anywhere. The spiritual mercury and sulfur of the tria-prima began to give way to the study of tangible elements and compounds that could be weighed, measured, and reliably tested. This was the birth of a new discipline, one built directly upon the scorched workbenches of the alchemists. They were the ones who designed the very backbone of the chemical laboratory. The complex glassware of distillation, the alembics and retorts, became the standard tools for purifying substances. The water bath, invented by Maria the Jewess, is still a fundamental piece of equipment in every modern chemistry lab, known by its French name, the bain-marie. Alchemists perfected the art of crystallization to purify salts, developed filtration techniques to separate solids from liquids, and pioneered the use of controlled heating in sealed vessels. Their relentless, often dangerous, experimentation also led to the discovery of entirely new substances that would become the building blocks of modern science. They were the first to produce powerful mineral acids like sulfuric acid, nitric acid, and hydrochloric acid, corrosive liquids that became essential reagents for all future chemical analysis. They discovered phosphorus, isolated various metal salts, and learned to create potent alcoholic tinctures. Every time an alchemist carefully recorded the exact temperature at which a metal melted, or noted the precise color change in a solution, they were taking a small, unconscious step away from mystery and toward the scientific method. So why did this ancient art eventually fall from grace? The rising tide of the scientific revolution in the 17th century championed a different kind of knowledge. Thinkers like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, who were themselves deeply influenced by alchemical ideas, began to insist on a clear separation between objective observation and spiritual speculation. The new science demanded that a phenomenon be explained through mechanical laws and mathematical relationships, not through planetary influences or the struggle of metaphysical principles. The core alchemical goal of transmutation could not be reliably demonstrated under these new, stricter rules. While an alchemist might see a successful experiment as a unique moment of cosmic alignment, a chemist required a formula that would work on a Tuesday in London just as well as it did on a Friday in Paris. This demand for reproducibility was the death knell for the old, secretive ways. The mystical language and symbolic codes that once protected the art now made it seem suspicious and unscientific to a new generation of thinkers. Yet the divorce was not total. Many foundational alchemical concepts were validated and absorbed into the new science. The painstaking laboratory techniques they developed became standard practice. Their belief that matter was composed of fundamental particles prefigured atomic theory. Their practical discoveries, from new acids to medicinal tinctures, filled the shelves of the first apothecaries and chemical supply houses. What was discarded was the soul of the endeavor, the idea that every chemical reaction was simultaneously a step on a spiritual journey. The laboratory ceased to be a chapel and became a workshop. The quest for the philosopher's stone was abandoned, but in its place, humanity gained the periodic table, a different kind of map to the secrets of matter, one that was open for all to read and build upon. The symbols of the laboratory bled directly onto the canvas. Renaissance masters, often patrons of the same wealthy nobles who funded alchemists, wove these cryptic emblems into their most celebrated works. In the fantastical and terrifying triptychs of Hieronymus Bosch, like the Garden of Earthly Delights, the entire composition can be read as an alchemical allegory. The left panel, with its serene and uncorrupted creation, represents the primal, unified matter. The central panel, a chaotic orgy of bizarre figures and hybrid creatures, mirrors the stage of putrefaction and dissolution, where all forms break down into a swirling chaos. Finally, the right panel, a hellscape of punishment, reflects the blackening or negrido, the necessary fire that purges impurity. Bosch was not painting mere fantasy, he was mapping the stages of the great work onto the human condition. Leonardo da Vinci, with his insatiable curiosity for all natural processes, was deeply fascinated by the transformative power alchemy described. His detailed studies of swirling water, turbulent air, and the interplay of light and shadow are investigations into the very elements alchemists sought to command. His obsession with flux and metamorphosis, the way a smile can flicker or a landscape can erode, echoes the core alchemical belief in a universe constantly striving toward or falling from a state of perfection. These artists understood that the pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone was a dramatic human story, a struggle between base desire and spiritual yearning, and they painted that eternal conflict in layers of oil and symbol. This symbolic language flowed just as powerfully into the written word. Centuries earlier, Geoffrey Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, included a telling story called the Canon's Yeoman's Tale. It is a brutally satirical and surprisingly detailed account of a fraudulent alchemist and his assistant, a tale born from Chaucer's own likely exposure to the alchemical circles of his time. He describes the soot-stained faces, the broken vessels, and the empty promises, capturing both the widespread fascination with the art and the cynical awareness of its deceptions. William Shakespeare, that master of human transformation, repeatedly drew upon alchemical imagery. In King Lear, the Mad King's journey through storm and suffering is a spiritual Negrido, a destructive purification that strips him of his royal pride until only his bare, essential humanity remains. The Tempest in his final play is not just a storm, but the alchemical vessel of the island itself, where the base metal of vengeance and ambition is transmuted into the gold of forgiveness and reconciliation. The most direct literary monument to this tradition is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust. Here, the entire alchemical quest is reimagined on a monumental scale. The scholar Faust makes a pact with the devil Mephistopheles not for gold but for ultimate knowledge and experience, the true goals of the inner alchemist. In a famous scene, Faust and his assistant Wagner even create a homunculus, a tiny being of pure consciousness trapped in a glass vial, who yearns for a physical body and a genuine life. This artificial man is the perfect symbol of the alchemical dream, a creation of intellect and will that ultimately questions the very nature of existence and soul. Why did these themes hold such power for artists and writers for so long? The alchemical process provided a ready-made narrative structure of death and rebirth, of struggle and ultimate transcendence. It was a powerful metaphor for the creative process itself. An artist begins with the base matter of a blank canvas or a block of stone, subjects it to the fire of their imagination and skill, and through a long and disciplined labor coaxes out a perfected form. A writer takes the chaotic raw material of human experience and refines it through the alembic of narrative into a story that reveals some essential truth. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone was at its heart the story of striving for the impossible, a theme that resonates with any creative act. This legacy is far from dead. The rich symbolism of alchemy provides a deep well for modern fantasy and science fiction. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein's laboratory is a direct descendant of the alchemist's workshop, and his creature is a new kind of homunculus, a being assembled from base matter and animated by a mysterious spark. In our own time, the entire premise of the Harry Potter series is steeped in alchemical lore, from the Philosopher's Stone itself being the object of desire in the first book, to the overarching theme of a young wizard's transformation from an ordinary boy into a hero who can conquer death. Even in the futuristic landscapes of science fiction, the core ideas persist. The dream of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence is the modern equivalent of the homunculus, the desire to create and perfect life through a formula. The transmutation of elements, once the domain of the Athana, is now the goal of particle accelerators. The symbols have changed from green lions and philosophical eggs to double helixes and neural networks, but the human yearning they represent, the drive to understand, control, and perfect the fundamental nature of reality remains utterly unchanged, a timeless current flowing from the smoky fires of the medieval laboratory into the bright, uncertain future. The same ancient recipes once dismissed as mystical nonsense are now being examined under the powerful lens of modern science. In laboratories equipped with electron microscopes and spectrometers, researchers are discovering that the alchemists were not just dreamers, they were intuitive material scientists. Their centuries-old work with acids, metals, and distillation created the foundational toolkit for chemistry. The powerful mineral acids they first produced, like sulfuric and nitric acid, are still essential industrial reagents today. Their meticulous processes for distillation and crystallization are standard procedures in every chemistry lab on the planet. The alchemists were pioneering experimentalists, and we are only now beginning to understand the true sophistication of their results. Perhaps the most startling validation comes from the field of nanotechnology. When modern scientists recreate the convoluted recipes for the philosopher's stone, they are not finding lumps of gold. Instead, they are discovering that these processes, which involve repeated dissolution, heating, and coagulation, can create tiny, engineered structures. Some of these recipes produce what we would now call colloidal gold, a suspension of minuscule gold particles that can appear a brilliant ruby red. Others seem to yield unusual glass ceramic composites or metallic films with properties we are just starting to analyze. The alchemists, through their obsessive, long-term manipulations, were accidentally creating nanomaterials, substances with unique optical and chemical characteristics that exist at a scale invisible to the naked eye. Their stone may not have been a magical powder, but it could have been a substance with genuinely unusual properties, its color changes and perceived powers stemming from physics operating at the molecular level. This material science perspective is only one side of a fascinating coin. In the 20th century, the psychologist Carl Jung proposed a radically different form of validation. He argued that alchemy was not a failed precursor to chemistry, but a profound projection of the human psyche onto the world of matter. For Jung, the entire great work was a symbolic map of the process of individuation, the journey toward wholeness and self-realization. The stages of nigredo, albedo, and rubedo were not chemical steps but representations of psychological states. The nigredo was a depression or a dark night of the soul, a necessary confrontation with the shadow self. The albedo symbolized a cleansing and an awakening of consciousness. The final rubedo represented the integration of the personality, the birth of the true self. In this view, the philosopher's stone was the symbol of the fully realized individual. Jung saw the cryptic art as a priceless record of humanity's unconscious striving for psychological health, a system that found profound value not in its physical products, but in its power to describe the inner transformation of a human being. The union of king and queen in the flask was the marriage of the conscious and unconscious mind. The death and resurrection of the materials mirrored the death of the ego and the birth of a more authentic identity. This psychological interpretation gave alchemy a new life, framing it as a timeless guide for personal growth. Today, the investigation continues on multiple fronts. Historians of science are collaborating with chemists to perform a kind of archaeological chemistry. They take precise instructions from manuscripts like the Ripley Scroll or the writings of George Starkey, and using modern analytical equipment, they attempt to reverse engineer what these adepts were actually making in their flasks. They analyze the chemical pathways, identify intermediate compounds, and document the surprising material transformations that occur when these ancient recipes are followed to the letter. This research is revealing that many alchemical processes were far more complex and controlled than previously believed. What was once seen as chaotic experimentation is now recognized as a sophisticated, if symbolically encoded, form of early material science. The legacy of the alchemists, therefore, is not a single truth, but a rich tapestry woven from physical discovery and psychological insight. They were, in a sense, the first nanoscientists and the first depth psychologists all at once. Their enduring power lies in this dual nature, speaking simultaneously to our desire to master the outer world of matter and to understand the vast, uncharted territory within ourselves. So the question remains, did any alchemist truly succeed? Centuries of legend and testimony stand in stark contrast to the silence of our museums, which hold no certified pieces of alchemical gold. The historical record is a labyrinth of tantalizing claims and frustrating dead ends. Consider the case of the 18th century German alchemist Johann Friedrich Bircher. Held prisoner by Augustus the Strong of Saxony, Bircher was under immense pressure to produce gold. He failed in that legendary task, but his alchemical research into clays and high-temperature furnaces did lead him to a different kind of gold. He accidentally discovered the secret to making true, hard-paste porcelain, a formula that had been Europe's own philosopher's stone for decades, earning his prince a fortune and founding the famed Mason porcelain works. Was this the real transmutation all along, a process that turned base clay into a substance as valuable as gold? This story highlights a central mystery. Were the successes of alchemy simply these kinds of brilliant mistakes, or did a few adepts actually achieve the ultimate goal, only to have the knowledge vanish with them? The possibility that genuine secrets were lost is a haunting one. Manuscripts were burned, libraries were scattered, and masters died before passing their full understanding to an apprentice. An alchemist's knowledge was not just a set of instructions, it was a lived experience, a tactile skill in judging heat by the color of a flame, or a spiritual readiness that could not be written down. What if the secret to the stone was not merely a chemical formula, but a specific state of consciousness in the operator, a key that was lost when the last true adept passed away? This would mean the recipes we have are incomplete, missing the final, unwritten ingredient. Modern researchers are now trying to supply that missing context through experimental archaeology. In laboratories at universities like Chicago and Indiana, historians and chemists are collaborating to recreate the exact conditions described in texts attributed to figures like Irenaeus Philalades. They build replicas of 17th century furnaces, source period-appropriate chemicals, and follow the convoluted recipes step by step, no matter how bizarre the instructions seem. They are not seeking to make gold, but to understand what the alchemists were actually observing. These experiments have revealed astonishing things: that many alchemical processes, when followed precisely, produce complex and beautiful chemical reactions, including the creation of brightly colored metallic films and unusual glass-like materials that would have seemed miraculous to a medieval observer. The dragon that devours its own tail in the illustrations might be a chemical cycle of dissolution and recrystallization. The death of the king and queen could be the dramatic reaction of gold with mercury. These modern adepts are decoding the art not as magic, but as a sophisticated, alternative language for describing material transformations, yet some puzzles remain stubbornly locked. Certain manuscripts, like the intensely symbolic Book of Lambspring, present a sequence of images so cryptic that their chemical meaning continues to elude full explanation. A stag and a unicorn drinking from a fountain, a two-headed eagle, a phoenix in flames, each image is a riddle. Are they a spiritual roadmap, a laboratory manual, or both at once? The most famous unsolved cipher of all is the Voynich manuscript, a book filled with bizarre botanical illustrations and an unknown script that has resisted every attempt at decoding for centuries. While not purely an alchemical text, its existence stands as a monument to the possibility that an entire system of knowledge, perhaps including alchemical secrets, remains hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right key. The greatest mystery of medieval alchemy, then, may not be whether they could make gold, but whether we have fully understood what they were truly trying to tell us. Medieval alchemists were far more than the gold-obsessed mystics of popular imagination. They were pioneering scientists, spiritual seekers, and innovative thinkers operating entirely within the worldview of their time. Their grand quest for transformation, both of base metals and the human soul, laid the essential foundations for modern chemistry, medicine, and even psychology. In their relentless drive to unlock the secrets of matter, they gave us the very tools of the laboratory, from distillation apparatus to the principles of experimental research. They were the first to explore the powerful idea that specific chemicals could target disease, paving the way for modern pharmacology. And in their cryptic symbols, we find a profound map of the human psyche's journey toward wholeness, a language for inner change that still resonates today. Beyond the test tubes and furnaces, they left behind a breathtaking legacy of art and symbolism, their philosophical struggles painted by masters like Bosch and woven into the very fabric of our greatest literature. The true secret they guarded so fiercely may not have been a literal formula for gold. Instead, it was the demonstration of how relentless curiosity and a willingness to dance with fire and poison could advance human knowledge against all odds. Their story is a powerful reminder that the boundaries we draw between science, spirituality, and art are often illusory. In the smoky glow of the Athena, these disciplines were once a single, unified pursuit, a quest to understand everything from the stars above to the spirit